Haunted by an itchy ear for 21 days, what he discovered inside was sinister and spine-chilling. Mark could feel it creeping into his life, feeding like an unseen parasite. The itch in his ear started as a mere nuisance, just a flicker of discomfort that brushed against his mind like the rustle of dry leaves on a windy afternoon. But 21 days later, that simple itch had transformed into a relentless torment, gnawing at him constantly, dragging him deeper into a darkness he couldn't explain. Each night transformed into a battle, where the shadows flitted on the edge of his vision, just out of reach, but very much present. In the suburban calm of Maplewood, where the genteel scent of fresh-cut grass mingled with the laughter of children playing, Mark found himself increasingly isolated. By day, he cared for Sarah and Ben, his two young kids, weaving a warm tapestry of a life without the woman who once completed it. But at night, he donned his uniform and became a security guard, patrolling the dimly lit aisles of stores that felt more like tombs than places of lively commerce. Despite his best efforts to crush the rising dread, the slower-than-usual breaths and twitching hands betrayed him. Then came the whispers, darting out from the woods bordering his yard, their sinister timbre pulling him off kilter every time he dared to listen. They wrapped around him like a cosmic fog, suffocating and disorienting, producing wild variations in the atmosphere. The neighbors, once vibrant poolside chatters, now exchanged furtive glances and whispered conversations that left him feeling like an outsider in a shared nightmare. Watching Sarah and Ben as they fixated on shadows in their playroom's silent laughs and wild gestures, as if conversing with phantoms, plunged him deeper into turmoil. He couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and dreadful lurked just beyond the curtain of their everyday lives. Before we continue, I need to tell you something important that's happening. YouTube has been making changes to their system and many people are missing notifications from channels they follow. If you're enjoying the content, click the bell and select all notifications so you don't miss future videos. And if you can leave a like, it really helps me with reach. Seriously, it makes a difference. Oh, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know who's on the other side of the screen. Now let's continue. Mark's whole world collapsed when he found an old journal at the crumbling library, the tales of a malevolent spirit woven into the very fabric of Maplewood's history. It sent a deep chill through him. Despair marked every letter as he delved deeper into the curses and bloodlines that intermingled in this seemingly peaceful neighborhood. With a growing dread, he began to understand that the itch creeping up his ear wasn't just a figment of his imagination. No, it was a physical manifestation of the ancient malevolence seeping into his family. On the last day of his waning sanity, he confronted an elderly woman who, with terrifying clarity, laid the ghost story bare. "You've walked the same ground," she wheezed, her bony finger pointing towards his front door. "The ties that bind may well lay wait, hungry for the next victim." A sliver of cold seeped through Mark's bones. He would have shaken it off as madness, but at that moment, the shadows twitched once more, drawing tighter around his family, cloaking them in dread. Mark stood there, heart racing and breath quickening, unsure if he could escape this legacy of ruin wrapping around his very being. The itch pulsed violently, and he could feel the oppressive weight of betrayal pressing down. What bones had once been buried were now clawing their way back to the surface. In the suffocating hush of Maplewood, Mark understood he wasn't just battling a curse, he was fighting against the very trust he placed in the faces he once called neighbors, and the family he had sworn to protect. The battle had only begun, and the night around him seemed pregnant with a sinister laughter. Would he uncover the power to sever the curse, or would the chilling familiarity of the comforting suburb become the very agent of his family's demise? Mark barely slept that night. Every rustle in the wind sent shivers down his spine, pulling him closer to the edge of madness. As dawn broke, he stumbled into the kitchen. The familiar smell of coffee felt foreign, tainted by a bitterness he couldn't shake. Sarah's warm laughter echoed in the background as she playfully wrestled with her younger brother, but even their innocent joy couldn't penetrate the suffocating fog of anxiety clinging to him. To distract himself, he took his kids to the park nearby, hoping that the vibrant greens and sunshine would ease the weight on his soul. But the whispers were louder there. They slithered between the trees, creeping into his thoughts, twisting around him, tugging at his sanity. Bees buzzed and children squealed, yet all he could hear were those haunting murmurs. "Daddy, look at this." Ben called, his little fingers pointing at a butterfly fluttering nearby, but Mark only nodded mechanically, his eyes scanning the tree-line. It was as if something watched him from between the branches. The children's laughter faded into the background as a chill settled within him. After an hour, he couldn't bear the park's cheerful facade. "Let us head home," he said, his voice breaking as he herded them back. The moment they crossed the threshold, Mark felt the familiar itch crawl up his ear, like 1,000 tiny ants storming through his head. That night, he decided to confront the shadows. Taking a deep breath, Mark clutched the journal. It was time to face whatever was lurking in his past and his home. The kids were asleep, their soft breaths barely piercing through the oppressive silence of the house. The air felt thick, charged with an unseen energy. Restless and eager that he moved through the dark hallways, the book casting eerie shadows against the walls. The whispers intensified as he approached his own bedroom. Once again, those words loomed over him. The ties that bind. A wave of nausea rolled through him as the itch became unbearable, driving him toward the bathroom mirror. What he saw made him recoil. There, nestled within the dark recess of his ear, a small shadow flickered almost alive, writhing with a malicious intensity. Panic surged. Mark struck at his ear, desperate to remove the source of torment, but instead, a searing pain shot through him, causing him to gasp. He staggered back into the living room, heart hammering. The shadows twisted and turned, framing his vision, mocking him. Each flicker of darkness seemed to morph into familiar faces, neighbors, friends, even his late wife. How were they all intertwined with the spirit that cursed him? Mark's racing thoughts shattered when the voices rose to a deafening crescendo. "You are one of us," they hissed, vibrating deep in his core. Each syllable burrowed into his consciousness, blurring the boundaries between reality and nightmare. He could feel the walls closing in, the air thick with despair and decay. No more running or hiding. He clenched the journal tightly, determination coiling within him. The ancient malevolence had roots here, entangled in the homes of Maplewood. To break this curse, he needed to dig deeper into the dark history he had unearthed. He needed to expose what had been hidden for so long. Mark stood at the precipice of an unknown path, breathing heavily as something cold brushed against his neck. He turned sharply, heart racing, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. What truly lay in the depths of Maplewood's past, entwined with his family, waiting to ensnare him in its web of horrors? As he grasped for answers, he didn't notice how the shadows shifted. They coiled tighter, reaching toward him, whispering secrets meant to remain buried. Would he discover the truth before it consumed him whole? Mark's hands trembled as he stared at the flickering light of the candle on the table. Shadows danced around the room, twisting into grotesque shapes. He had retreated to the kitchen, searching for a haven from the pressure that bore down on him. But even here, the air felt suffocating, charged with the whispers that seemed to flutter like moths around a flame. That he flipped open the journal again, pages cracked and yellowed. Each entry pulled him deeper into a history fraught with secrets. He could feel the cold tendrils of fear wrapping around his spine as he skimmed through the notes left by those who had come before him. Maplewood was steeped in darkness, stories of betrayal, lost souls, and a curse that thrived on the innocence of its residents. "Mark?" Sarah's voice broke through the haze, full of concern. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light. Her expression reflected that nagging dread that he couldn't shake. "Are you okay?" "It's just the history of this place," he said, his voice strained. I feel it. Something's not right." She moved closer, peering over at the journal. "What have you found?" "Nothing that brings comfort." He could barely meet her eyes. "It's worse than I thought. It's all connected, to us." Her brow furrowed, but before she could respond, the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to pulsate, swaying as if alive. They twisted together, forming something like a human shape, yet wrong, unnatural. Mark's heart raced. "Do you see that?" Sarah looked where he pointed, but her gaze turned skeptical. "See what, Mark?" "No. Right there." He shouted, desperation seeping into his voice. But the moment he blinked, the darkness returned to its harmless form, and she simply stared back at him with a mixture of worry and disbelief. "Maybe you should get some rest," she suggested gently. "I can't, not yet." Mark swallowed, clenching the journal as another wave of nausea crashed over him. The whispers returned, louder now, each syllable tauntingly clear. "You're one of us." His ears throbbed, the crawling sensation inside them escalating. He felt feverish, the heat crawling up his neck. Shouting above the cacophony, he said, "Sarah, I think it's in me. Whatever it is, it's inside me." "Mark, stop." She pleaded, stepping back, her expression turning to one of fear. "You're scaring the kids." "No, you don't understand. It wants me." He pressed the palms of his hands against his ears, trying to block out the deafening resonance of the voices, but they seeped into his thoughts, weaving their way into the very fabric of his being. "Mark." She grabbed his shoulders, shaking him slightly. "Look at me. You're here. You're with us." But even through her reassurance, his mind raced to the dark legacy of Maplewood. Those lost souls, lurking in the shadows, seeking a vessel to ensnare, whispering secrets to lure him in. He had stumbled into this nightmare and now it wouldn't he let him go. Then, in the blink of an eye, the air shifted. A sudden chill filled the room, casting an icy breath along his skin. Goosebumps erupted across his arms. The shadows thickened, merging into an unforgiving mass, stretching toward him, hungry for release. "Sarah!" He screamed, desperate, but the words caught in his throat as the dark entity edged closer, stretching its hand-like forms towards him. In that moment, a blinding flash of clarity struck him. This was not just a haunting, it was a confrontation. A choice lay before him: fight this darkness or let it consume him. With every ounce of resolve, he hurled the journal to the floor, shouting, "I want to be yours. Not now, not ever." Just as the shadows lunged, a loud bang echoed from the doorway. Ben's voice rang out, high-pitched and terrified, "Daddy." Mark turned, his heart racing, but the shadows shrieked, a cacophony of rage that echoed through the kitchen. They recoiled, seething, caught between their fury and the innocence of his child. In that split second of vulnerability, Mark understood. He had to protect his family at all costs. But facing something ancient and malevolent was far from simple. "Stay back," he ordered, positioning himself between the malicious force and his children. But as the shadows flickered and twisted around him, he wondered, had he awakened a force far beyond his capacity to battle? What unfolded next could seal their fates forever? Would his family survive the night, or was this just the beginning of a more terrifying chapter in Maplewood's sinister history? "Daddy!" Ben's terrified call echoed through the dark kitchen, slicing through Mark's paralysis. The shadows writhed, momentarily distracted by the innocent cry. Mark seized the opportunity, pushing himself toward his son. He caught a glimpse of fear mirrored in Ben's wide eyes, a look that could freeze the blood. "Get behind me, buddy!" Mark shouted, forcing his voice to sound firm, though terror clutched his heart like a vice. Looking back at Sarah, he saw her face pale, stricken with horror. She couldn't grasp the full scope of the nightmare unfolding, but the fear in her gaze told him she sensed the gravity of the moment. The pulsating shadows, not entirely corporeal yet unsettlingly close, began to close in again, their movements electric and purposeful. Each dark tendril seemed intent on seepage, finding ways to worm into the space between his skin and soul. "You have to go," he urged Sarah, but she didn't budge. Rooted by both fear and determination, the dark entities responded to his panic. Their shrieks intensified, an awful cacophony that seemed to echo memories of anguish and despair, merging torment with a promise of power. Mark braced himself as the shadows stretched toward him, whispering sweetly poisonous words, "Join us, embrace the darkness." It felt like they were prying open his consciousness, searching for chinks in his armor. Memories of Maplewood flooded his mind, the secrecy, the rage, the loss. He pressed a hand against the wall to steady himself, the cool surface a stark contrast to the heat radiating from the shadows. If they reached him, what would become of Ben and Sarah? Mark. Sarah rushed towards him, panic turning her steps into frantic motions. Don't let it in. Please. I'm trying, but it's everywhere. His voice cracked as the entities shrieked back. He could feel them slithering closer, a cold breath brushing against his cheeks. He needed clarity, a way to resist. But how? In that moment of despair, a glimmer of thought sparked within him. The journal. It had details about Maplewood and its terrible curse. Mark glanced toward the floor where it lay, a beacon of knowledge in the encroaching darkness. Ben. He hollered, trying to keep his eyes focused. Look for the journal. Knock it away from the shadows. The boy's gaze shifted. What if it gets me, Daddy? It will. If I can't stop it, you have to help. Now. The urgency in his voice drove a panic-fueled resolve into Ben's small frame. With determination, he moved toward the journal, crouching between Mark and the encroaching shadows. As Ben reached for it, the shadows recoiled like a cat to water, screeching, their forms flickering in agitation. Mark felt the pressure ease for a moment. Get it, son. We need the truth. With shaking hands and grim determination, Ben grasped the journal and pulled it toward him, but sent it sliding too close to the edge of the table. Mark shouted, "No!" As time slowed. He lunged forward, shadows lunging with their own intent. Suddenly, everything erupted. A burst of energy exploded from the journal, illuminating the kitchen like a thunderclap. Mark shielded his eyes as the light engulfed the dark figures, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. When the brightness faded, the kitchen stood still, basked in a startling calm. Ben clutched the journal tightly, wide-eyed with disbelief, while Mark froze in place, breathless. What just happened? Sarah whispered, taking a small step forward, uncertain. Did we win? Ben asked, voice trembling yet filtered with hope. Mark bent down, peering at the journal as it glowed faintly, revealing the broken words of past victims and the curse binding Maplewood. The shadowy threat felt momentarily staved, but Mark's gut told him this was far from over. He glanced at Sarah, and they shared a look, the kind that needed no words, only understanding. They had survived this encounter, but at what cost? What do we do now? Ben asked, his childish innocence bringing with it the weight of their circumstances. Mark's answer hung heavy in the air, dark and unending. Now we find out what happens next. The shadows had receded, but the night was far from over. What other terrors lay hidden just beyond their reach? The journal radiated a faint glow, pulsing like a heartbeat, a reminder of the chaos they had just escaped. Mark reached out, hesitating for a moment as he felt an unexplainable chill ripple through the air. We need to read it, he said, breaking the silence, his voice low and unsteady. He carefully opened the journal, the pages brittle and worn, a history of despair etched in jagged handwriting. Words spiraled into hard truths about Maplewood, each sentence painted a grim portrait of lives lost to darkness. As he read, the air thickened, steeped in the scent of mildew and decay. Listen to this, Mark murmured, his eyes darting across the page. It says. His voice faltered as he turned to Sarah, the darkness, it's a curse. It feeds on fear. It can take any shape, any form. Ben, still clutching tightly to his father's waist, peered at the pages, shivering. What does it want? Mark's heart raced as he forced himself to read on, fighting back the rising tide of dread. It wants to spread. It needs a host to thrive. The cold pressed harder against his skin, the walls around them seeming to pulse with a life of their own. There's mention of a ritual, he continued, each word feeling heavier, to bind the darkness. They say it must be performed at the stroke of midnight when the moon is full. If we don't. A sudden crash echoed from the other room, cutting through Mark's words like a knife. The shadows seemed to twitch, hungry for the sound of their terror. Every instinct screamed for Mark to flee, but he couldn't. Not when Ben was at his side. Stay close. He commanded, gripping Ben's shoulder. Sarah nodded, her eyes slightly wild, but the resolve was stronger than fear now. The journal might hold the key, but they needed to act swiftly. The sound of scraping claws skittered in the darkness, crawling closer, as if the very walls were alive, urging them to succumb to despair. Mark and Sarah rushed toward the kitchen doorway, ready to explore the source of the disturbance, the journal tucked under Mark's arm. "Think it's another one?" Sarah hissed, glancing back as they crept through their dimly lit home. Before Mark could answer, the shadows gathered again, darker and more malevolent. He felt the atmosphere shift, a tangible heaviness descending, thickening with each step they took. The air crackled, tension coiling around them like a noose. "Why are you doing this?" Mark shouted into the void, anger lacing his voice. It was a desperate plea, trying to tether his courage. The shadows writhed, almost as if in response, coiling tighter around Ben's little form. Another piercing shriek erupted from the dark, reverberating through the walls, a sound mixed with laughter and despair. They danced tauntingly around, as if drawing from their fear, feeding off it. "Look!" Ben pointed, his voice a frightened squeak. Mark turned to see a figure emerge from the darkness, flickering like a broken film reel. It had no face, just a swirling void where one should be. A tendril shot out, reaching for them. Time slowed as Mark's instincts kicked in, he threw himself in front of Ben. "Run!" he screamed. They darted through the doorway into the living room, the entity ripping at the air behind them, its whispers sinister and hard to comprehend. "A ritual, Mark." Sarah panted, urgency in her voice as they stumbled over furniture. "We need to do it now." But they were running out of time, darkness was already wrapping around their feet, threatening to pull them back into its icy grip. "What if it's too late?" Mark shot back, his mind racing. "Then we'll find another way." Sarah countered, determination surging through her, with the journal rubble in their minds. They sprinted toward anything resembling hope as the figure closed in, its raspy laughter echoing through the room like a death knell. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as the shadows narrowed their focus. "What happens when the clock strikes 12? What's the price we have to pay?" Ben's voice broke through the chaos. "What if we give it what it wants?" Silence fell heavily for a moment, a weight too palpable to ignore. Mark froze. What was Ben really suggesting? The shadows pulsed, ready to consume. An idea took root, and dread coiled tighter around his mind. "We need to make a choice fast," he murmured, eyes darting between the approaching shadows and the only way forward. The sound of the ticking clock blasted through the kitchen, each tick counting down to a moment that could bind them or end them. "Just remember," Sarah whispered, "whatever it wants, we have to outsmart it." Mark nodded, mind racing to form a plan. But could they turn the tide against the darkness lurking just a heartbeat away, or would they lose themselves in its hungry embrace? The shadows lunged with renewed fury, pushing them to the edge. Time was slipping away, and the very fabric of their reality was unraveling. Mark's heart sank. What dreadful, unimaginable price awaited them? As the clock struck another second, they stood poised at an impossible crossroads, knowing that whatever they chose would change everything. "Ben!" Mark shouted, pulling his son closer as the shadows thickened, a dark tide surging at their feet. Panic gripped him, twisting his gut like a vice. He could feel the icy fingers of the darkness inching up his legs, seeking to pull him under, to drown them all in despair. "Do you want to negotiate?" He shouted defiantly into the void, as if speaking to the entity itself. "What do you want from us?" The shadows seemed to howl in response, a cacophony of sibilant whispers filling the room, mocking his bravery. Each voice echoed like thunder against his skull, words distorted, incoherent. "Now's not the time, Mark." Sarah snapped, her grip on Ben tightening. "We need to move." They darted toward the front door, the creeping darkness scrambling at their heels, clawing to ensnare them in its grasp. "Quick! The journal!" Mark shouted, remembering the words that could hold a key, a way out. "It said those things are not going to help us." Sarah screamed. We got to another crash echoed through the hallway, shaking the walls, sending a shudder of terror through them. They skidded to a stop, the entryway just ahead, as the shadows surged forward, reacting to the sound with gleeful malice. The air grew frigid, every breath a labor. "Ben, run into the light," Mark urged, but Ben's terrified eyes were glued to the growing dark mass, a swirling vortex hungry for fear. "This way." Sarah pointed to the kitchen, an old save for many panicked moments. They hastily turned, scrambling through the doorway as the tendrils of shadow reached out, grazing Ben's ankle. He yelped, stumbling, but Sarah yanked him forward, her determination unyielding. "Help me!" Mark shouted, reaching for the journal. He stumbled against the counter, rummaging through the clutter, desperate for the answers that could save them. "Find it," Sarah urged, fear slicing through her voice. "Here." Mark finally gasped, producing the journal, its pages shimmering ominously, the glow pulsing like an erratic heartbeat against the darkness. "What now?" she panted, glancing nervously at the shadowy mass inching closer. "Find the ritual, there has to be an incantation or something." Mark's hands shook as he flipped desperately through the pages, sweat trickling down his back. A loud crash sounded behind them. The door frame cracked, a splintering sound that crashed through their desperate search for hope. With trembling hands, Mark found the section about the binding ritual. His eyes widened as he read the words aloud, "The power to bind the curse lies in the heart, within the offering of fear, dread shall be contained." "But what does that mean?" Sarah asked, frowning. Their eyes darted to Ben, who stood shivering, his face pale. "Ben, I want to let it take you," Mark yelled, but the weight of reality crashed upon him. We might have to offer it." Ben's voice trembled, sounding fragile yet wise, cutting through the huskiness of despair. "What it wants, Dad, it wants fear." "No," Mark cried, "I want to do that." But he could see the shadows dancing nearer, pulsing with anticipation, hunger driving their insatiable need. "We can fight it," Sarah insisted, her eyes fierce. "We can turn this against them." "Help him, Mark." Ben's wide, innocent eyes locked onto his father's. "I'm not scared, not with you here." "Ben, no." Mark stepped back, heart pounding. The shadows roared, thrashing against the walls, the laughter reverberating like a storm. "Say it," Sarah urged. "Say it now." Mark inhaled sharply, his choice crashing down like the weight of the world. "To make the offering," he whispered, preparing to sacrifice the last flicker of hope, but before he could speak the words, energy crackled through the air as the clock on the wall began to tremble. The shadows recoiled, screeching. "What's happening?" Sarah cried, as the lights flickered wildly, illuminating the room with a distorted glow. All seemed ready to implode. As the clock ticked on, the final strokes echoed, resonating deeper and more chilling. The air thickened with despair, and as Mark's breath caught in his throat, it dawned on him, the shadows were no longer just nearby. They were inside his mind now, seeking to twist his darkest thoughts into reality. "What's the price?" Mark's words hung in the air, heavy with dread. And just like that, they would have to make a choice to bind the darkness forever or risk losing everything to its unyielding grasp. The clock struck 12, and an unsettling calm settled in the room. What horrors awaited them on the other side of the midnight hour? The midnight chime resonated like a death knell, and in that heavy silence, it felt as if the world had momentarily paused, taking a breath before plunging into chaos again. Mark's heart raced, every beat drumming a warning as the shadows pulsed around them, a living, breathing darkness. What just happened? Sarah's voice trembled, and her eyes darted between the journal and Ben, who stood frozen, lost in the haze of confusion and fear. Mark's thoughts spiraled a little more as he felt that dread close in, twisting his gut. What decision could he possibly make? "If we give them fear," he started, voice shaking but determined. "What if it doesn't work?" Before they could contemplate the possibilities, a chilling laugh erupted from the shadows. It echoed through the kitchen, wrapping around them like a frozen hug. It sounded almost familiar, teasing and mocking. Mark's fists clenched as he turned to glare at the darkness, righteous anger boiling within him. "Get away from us!" he shouted, but the shadows only shrieked, as if egging him on. Suddenly, a flicker at the edges of the room caught his eye. A light pale and ghostly flickered to life, illuminating a narrow passage into the pantry. It beckoned them with its weak glow, an oasis amid the encroaching darkness. "That light, we need to get to it," Sarah urged, tugging at Ben's arm, but her gaze remained locked on the shifting shadows, which seemed to throb in anger at the light's emergence. "Move!" Mark bellowed, the primal instinct to protect his family propelling him forward. With each step, the coldness clawed at his legs, a desperate grip trying to thwart their escape. Ben clutched the journal to his chest, following his parents, but the shadows coiled around his ankles, a suffocating weight. Mark wrenched his son free, adrenaline fueling his movements. "Keep going!" he shouted, urging them through the pantry door that had swung wide in anticipation, ready to swallow them whole. Inside the pantry, the light flickered stronger, revealing shelves of jars, all neatly arranged, but inside them were not pickles or preserves. Faces twisted in silent screams stared back at them, solidifying the terror gnawing at Mark's insides. He recoiled, heart hammering. "What the hell is this?" "Mark! Focus!" Sarah's panicked tone shot him back to the present. "We have to find something, anything to fight this thing." Ben was trembling near the edge of the light, shadowy tendrils tossing about like snakes. "Dad, maybe we should try what the journal said." "We need to, it's too dangerous." Mark interrupted, glancing at the door, now pulsating with a life of its own. "We don't even know if we can trust it." But the shadows surged forward with renewed vigor, as if they were feasting on the uncertainty swirling in his mind. The pantry felt claustrophobic, the air thickening under the crushing weight of despair. "We don't have a choice," Sarah shouted, pushing Ben forward. "It's building up, it wants us to break." With his body trembling, Mark gripped the journal, flicking through pages, every line blurring together until he caught sight of a flicker of an incantation: "In fear we thrive, and so shall we bind." But before they could act, the pantry doors slammed shut, cutting them off from the world outside. Shadows poured in through the gaps, whispering secrets, taunting them, growing louder in their demands. The light flickered weakly, as if it too was in desperate prayer. "Whatever we do it now." Mark's shout cut through the panic. Each moment was a sliding scale of terror, and the shadows were grinning wide, hungry for their despair. The darkness reached out, clawing, dragging, and slicing through reason. The journal was suddenly and violently ripped from Mark's grasp, tumbling into the void. "No!" he screamed, lunging for it, but the shadows coiled tighter. "Ben! Hold on to something!" Sarah cried, her voice edged in sheer terror. But the shadows lashed out, and even the pantry's weak light flickered as darkness pulled them toward its gaping maw. Mark fought to wrench Ben from its grip, he felt every heartbeat echoing his growing dread. They were caught in the crossfire of darkness and light, a battle threatening to consume them all. "What if?" Ben whispered, his wide eyes now more fearful than before. "What if they want us to give in?" "What do you mean, Ben?" Mark's voice hitched, uncertain now of their path. "Maybe they want our fear, but what if we turn it against them?" Before Mark could even ponder the implications, the shadows surged forward, an avalanche of despair, mocking laughter drowning out their hopes. The boundaries of sanity began to shatter, breathless chaos enveloping them. He could only hold Ben tighter, as they stood on the precipice of surrender. Would they fight the shadows, or let fear claim its offering? Then, a flicker pierced the darkness, an escape or a trap. The time to choose was now, but the uncertain truth loomed larger than the shadows themselves. Would they bravely confront the horror, or would they, in their despair, become part of the darkness? The shadows twisted like living nightmares themselves, creeping closer, their whispers growing louder, threatening to pierce through the fragile walls of sanity. Mark could feel Ben's small hands gripping his shirt tightly as terror painted the boy's face pale and hollow. Time seemed to stretch as Mark held them at the center of the chaos, heart racing, ears ringing with echoes of laughter that chilled him to the bone. "Ben, listen to me," Mark shouted, forcing his gaze back to his son. "I need you to focus. Whatever we decide, we have to do it together." But as Mark's words hung in the air, a shriek erupted from the pantry walls, pouring grains of shattered glass down like rain. It sounded like a million souls screaming in anguish, hungry for their attention, taunting them with memories of fear. It dug nails into the back of his mind, grounding him in the horror of their encroaching fate. That in an act of desperate defiance, Mark shouted, "We are not afraid." His voice trembled, barely masking the quavering of his resolve. He felt both powerful and powerless, like a candle flickering against an onslaught of wind. "Look, Dad." Ben pointed, his voice a hesitant thread among the chaos. "The jars, maybe they're connected to the shadows." Mark's gaze snapped to the twisted faces trapped inside the glass, their silence screams a testament to despair. Fury ignited within him, and he believed for a moment that if he could shatter those jars, the fear contained within would be unleashed, and maybe they could turn the tide. But Sarah's voice broke through. "Mark, the journal. The incantation, it mentioned something about binding fear. We can use it against them. Let us try," he said, voice steadied by new determination. If there was even the tiniest possibility to rid themselves of the torment, they had to take it. As Ben pulled the journal from the rubble, its pages fluttered wildly, as if desperate to share its secrets. A violent tremor shook the ground beneath their feet, and the pantry doors lurched, buckling inward as ominous laughter spilled into the room like a flood. Mark chanted the first few lines of the incantation he had glimpsed earlier, his voice rising in defiance against the encroaching void. "In fear we thrive, and so shall we bind. Keep going," Sarah urged, her eyes wide with hope and dread intertwining. As he recited the words, the faces in the jars began to pulse, their features twisting in response, shadowed apparitions emerging almost willingly from the light around them. The shadows shrieked, recoiling in agony at the incantation, the dark tendrils twisting away from the bright illumination caused by their own terror. For a brief moment, the pantry felt as if hope was clawing its way back, but the laughter bellowed again, deeper now, drowning out their incantation. Mark's throat tightened as he grabbed Ben's shoulder, moving them both closer to the source of the pale light. "We have to finish it," he shouted over the din. "They want our fear, and we want to give it to them." The shadows thickened, swirling around them, and as he chanted the next line, the pantry door trembled, rattling against the surge of dark energy. "We bind their grasp, their hold to forsake." A shadow lunged forward, a coiling mass that wrapped around Mark's legs, yanking him back with blinding force. Panic surged through him as he tumbled to the ground, losing focus. "No! Sarah! Ben! Dad!" Ben screamed, but Mark's vision blurred as he felt icy fingers clamping around his throat, choking the incantation right out of him. "Stay strong!" Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through, filled with the jagged edge of desperation. "Together!" she cried, and he could feel her warmth still pushing against the shadow's cold grasp. As darkness overwhelmed him, all he could hear was the agonizing silence of the jars, waiting. The shadows shifted in tandem, swirling around Ben and Sarah, their cries echoing through Mark's dulled mind. Then, in a twist of fate, he felt a surge of strength from within, fueled by their unity and undeniable bond forged in fear. In a last desperate attempt, Mark regained his footing. "Breathe!" It tumbled from his lips, a mantra against the oppressive darkness. "We fight this together." Suddenly, the pantry became a whirlwind of light and shadow, hope battling despair, revealing a path through the chaos. But would unity shatter the void, or were they simply amplifying the darkness lurking beneath? The light flickered, giving way to the chaos that threatened to consume everything around them. In that fleeting moment of realization, Mark saw now the path ahead, but which direction would grant deliverance from this haunting torment? The shadows tightened, snarling with an insatiable hunger. The air grew electric, charged with the dread of uncertainty. Would they emerge broken and lost, or as something far worse? The question lingered ominously as the darkness surged forward, ready to claim all they had left. The darkness swallowed the pantry whole, twisting the familiar space into a nightmarish cavern. Mark felt the weight of dread thicken the air, pressing down until it felt difficult to breathe. The shadows writhed around them, shadows with faces, hands reaching out, desperate to claw back what they had escaped. In the swirling chaos, Mark caught glimpses of the jars still pulsating, shimmering with trapped, desperate souls. His heart raced. "We have to break them," he shouted, ignoring the tight grip of icy fingers still clawing at his throat. "We release their fear, we turn it against them." "No." Sarah hesitated, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "What if that makes it worse? We need to be cautious." "But what choice do we have?" Mark spat, fury surpassing his fear as he kicked off the dark presence enveloping his legs. He lunged toward the nearest jar, driven by an instinct that screamed for action. "We need to do this now." The face inside one of the jars warped with anguish, its silent screams pleading for release. The air turned razor-sharp, stinging his skin as if the shadows were aware of his intentions. The shadows twisted more violently, swirling like a tempest, blocking his reach. "Mark." Ben's voice trembled, eyes wide with horror. "Don't do it. It feels wrong. They're angry." A chilling laugh echoed, intertwining with the cries of the trapped. The pantry trembled, and a claw-like hand of shadow shot forward, wrapping around Ben's wrist. "No!" Mark roared, lunging forward but feeling another dark tendril wrapping around his waist, anchoring him in place. With all his strength, he pulled against the shadow's grasp, adrenaline surging through him. "Let him go!" he yelled, but the shadows only tightened their hold, laughing with a sound that scraped against his sanity. "Sarah! We need the incantation!" Mark shouted, a wild panic filling his chest. "It's the only way." "I know!" she screamed, scrambling to locate the journal, its pages still fluttering like wings of trapped birds. But the relentless pressure of the shadows created a barrier around her. The whispers grew, promising darkness and despair, pulling at her mind. "Listen to me!" he yelled, his voice a fragile thread in the howling storm. "We call on our own fear. We are not just fighting them, we're fighting for our light." With the shadows writhing and retreating, Mark felt his heart race as he willed the incantation to his mind. He remembered the syllables, the rhythm of binding. "Together, we fight. Together, we awaken. Together." Ben echoed, his small voice breaking through the suffocating darkness. And suddenly, in that moment, a crack of fury ignited within Mark. The room flickered briefly, as if the light itself wanted to break free from its constraints. Blood pumping, he recited, "We bind their grasp, their hold to forsake, for in our unity, to dawn we awake." As they chanted together, the shadows flickered, faces contorting in terror. The connection felt electric, rippling through the air as if the very darkness was recoiling, unnerved by their courage, but just as victory seemed within reach, a tide of shadows launched toward them. Mark felt a surge of pain as he was thrown against the pantry wall, darkness clawing at his mind, whispering taunting him with old fears, old failures. "Fight it, Mark!" Sarah pleaded, her fingers gripping the journal tightly. "Don't let them into your head." Breathless, Mark strained against the seeping dread. With a final surge of will, he called out their names, the bond that anchored him in the storm. "Ben! Sarah! We are together!" And in that moment, the shadows screamed, a cacophony of despair crashing against their unity. Mark felt the shockwave as light burst through the pantry, illuminating everything in a searing brightness, but just as quickly as it came, the light dimmed. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the warmth of the moment. The shadows writhed, seeking to reclaim what they lost, and Mark knew then, they were not done yet. "What now, Mark?" Ben whispered, fear lacing his voice. As the pantry echoed with an Unsettling silence, the flickering shadows rearranged themselves, forming into a single dark entity that loomed before them, threatening to engulf them whole, and Mark realized, they had only just begun to fight. What dark truths still lay hidden among the jars, ready to be unleashed? As the shadows wriggled and twisted before them, Mark felt the weight of despair settle in. Each heartbeat rang loud against the silence, a reminder that the journey was far from over. The entity that loomed was almost majestic, a horrifying tapestry of darkness woven with anguish and ferocity. Together, we can't give in. He shouted desperately, his voice ringing out with a fierce resolve. The shadows seemed to pause, their attention focused like a spotlight on him. For one breathless moment, nothing moved. Those dark tendrils recoiled slightly, as if testing the resolve in his voice. Mark's chest tightened. He felt both powerful and haunted. "Say it." Ben shouted, his small voice cutting through the looming dread. "We've faced it before, we can do it again." "Yes." Sarah chimed in, her eyes wide, brimming with the determination he so desperately needed to see. "We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every soul they've trapped." Mark glanced down at Ben, who stood resolutely at his side, clutching the journal, filled with family history and ghostly tales. The boy's fear was tangible, but so was the luminous bravery that glinted in his eyes. Taking a shaky breath, he stepped forward, and the shadows twisted in response. "We bind your grasp." Mark began, echoing the ancient words that promised strength and unity. "We claim our fear and turn it back upon you." The shadows surged forward, like a raging tempest trying to smother them in its grasp, but Mark stomped forward, feeling Sarah's hand firmly gripping his. "Together, we fight. For all who suffered. For all who suffered." Ben echoed, raising the journal high. As he did, an ethereal glow emitted from its pages, illuminating the darkness that swirled around them. A faint warmth enveloped them, pushing against the icy fingers trying to claw their way deeper into their hearts. Mark could feel the intensity of the shadows shrinking in on themselves. The voices, the tortured cries of lost souls, they craved the light that radiated from his family. With every reciting word, the shadows seemed to writhe, flickering like disturbed insects under a blazing sun. "By the bond of love, we banish the dark. By the love of families and all their sparks." Mark recited, his voice growing stronger with every syllable. Brighter and brighter it became, battling the consuming void until he felt nearly weightless, running on nothing but hope. He summoned every joyful moment he had shared with Sarah and Ben, pictures of laughter, love, and warmth. "No! No!" The entity shrieked, voices erupting in a cacophony of rage. The menacing entity twisted as if trying to escape the blinding light. Shadows flickered helplessly, disintegrating into wisps, shrieking as they pulled away from the radiant honesty that surged from within the family bond. Mark could feel it, a sudden breakthrough, a release from the clutches of despair. In that moment, the pantry erupted in brilliant light. It wrapped around them, driving the darkness back, tearing at the shadows, disintegrating them into the very air. The pantry walls cracked softly but sharply, then faded away. Ben's small hands gripped the journal tighter, its edges starting to glow as if bathed in new life. With a final cry, the shadows melted into nothingness, a trailing whisper of what remained echoing like a lost memory, fading into the ether. When the light finally faded, silence hung profoundly over them like a serene blanket. The air felt different, lighter, freer. Mark looked around, his heart gnawing at uncertainty, but then he felt Sarah's hand squeeze his tightly. Did we do it?" Ben whispered, his voice weak but filled with hope. Mark nodded slowly, swept in a tide of relief. "We didn't just fight," Sarah added with tears sparkling in her eyes. "We won." But somewhere deep inside, Mark understood this was merely a chapter closed, not the finale. Maplewood would always have its secrets, echoes reverberating through its streets. They had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger, but the shadows of the past seldom linger without consequence. "I think we need to tell the others," Mark finally said, trying to mask the lingering shivers echoing in his heart. They need to know what happened. All of it. As they stepped out, the warmth of the sun greeted them, bright and welcoming. It felt good against his skin, and Mark took a moment, inhaling the sweet summer air, holding on to the core of his family. "I love you both," he said softly, looking from Sarah to Ben, recognizing the bond that was stronger than any darkness they had faced. "We'll face whatever comes next," Ben promised, and for a moment, that promise fluttered between them. Mark nodded, but unease whispered through his mind. The dark history of Maplewood might still be there, lurking in corners unnoticed, waiting to be uncovered again. This wasn't the end, but a rebirth. He squeezed their hands, taking a step forward into the light. Their family held the power to shatter the chains of fear, and today, they chose to let love lead the way. Now, if you love this journey, this is your moment to show your support. You need to subscribe immediately to the channel so you don't miss the next exclusive stories. Smash the like button now to feed the algorithm and keep us thriving. Flood the comments section with your reactions and theories about the ending. And for the love of all things entertaining, instantly share this video with at least 5 friends who need to see this conclusion. Don't wait even one more second to share. Only true fans understand the importance of these actions.